Majestic Comics presents Writing Your Script Example Act Structures, Part 1. So, as we learned before, all stories that you're going to write should have an act structure. And within that act structure, you can have important points of your story laid out and pre planned so you'll know when they'll come. And then you can kind of take the more amorphous plot that you have in your head and apply it to the act structure you want to use. And from there, things will just fall into place, which is what makes using an act structure so great. So let's look at some example act structures that you can use for your comic. The first one I'm going to go over is the OneAct, a one-act comic. In this, it's a very simple story. Basically, within the first few pages, something will happen that the characters need to react to, or which draws the characters into the events of the comic. So, in this example comic, we get a cold open to someone buying some kind of strange magical drug from some lady in what looks like an abandoned building. She wants to buy the thing which makes the drug, not just buy the drug, but she's rebuffed. So that kind of gives us our inciting incident for what's going to take place over this story. We haven't seen Catwoman yet, but she comes up next when she's hired to go steal the item which makes this magical drug. So she's going to break into that abandoned building and steal it. Seems simple enough. So our stories start with some kind of events going on that draw the characters in. Then the character in the middle part of the story is presented with this challenge. There should be some kind of difficult task they're going to face, which it's not certain that they will succeed at. Although, of course, usually we can expect the hero always does succeed. Our suspension of disbelief can be engaged, and we're not sure if Catwoman will successfully break in, survive, and steal the item. In the comic, she does break into the building. She's attacked by zombies. She gets away from zombies. She gets into a fight then with the guardian of the object, who she beats. And then she has the object, and then leaves the abandoned building with it. That is the majority of the story. It's not a very complex story, right? It's actually really simplistic. But it's a simple plot, it's easy to write, and it's easy to sort of execute as a beginning writer. Once the main challenge is over, then possibly we lead to a cliffhanger, which happens here as Catwoman is immediately double-crossed as she leaves the building by a group of lots and lots of men. Why these men couldn't steal the item, I don't know. But she's double-crossed and captured by these men who then will, of course, take the item and probably not pay her for successfully stealing it. That is basically your one act comic. Within the first 4 to 6 pages, I would recommend you present some situation which causes a call to action for the hero. The hero is then presented with a challenge. In this case, it was getting hired to steal something. It could be, less mercenary. Someone comes to the hero in need of help. If you're Superman, you hear someone who needs help, you go and help them. The initial incident could involve the hero. Something goes wrong for them, and then they go, I got to fix this problem, Somebody hit me upside the head with a crowbar and stole my magic cape. I got to go get my magic cape back. Whatever it is, there's an initial setup which presents the inciting incident, and then there is a challenge which makes up the vast majority of the book, everything in the middle, and then there's a cliffhanger ending which maybe is 4 pages. So while there's not a lot of story here, at least you have plenty of space to do what you want to do, especially if you have a lot of action scenes. I notice a lot of comic books nowadays. A lot of comic books nowadays will have these very slow stories, and then they can linger on the action, but then they do a poor job lingering on the action. I think that's a terribly bad idea. If you're going to do a simple plot, you need to have something else which makes it worthwhile. Now, that's a little more on the professional side. As you're just getting started, simple plot works well for you, then that's great. It's okay as a beginner. You don't have to, blow the doors off with your comic and how complex and how detailed and how well the art is and how well the action scenes are. It doesn't all have to be brilliant yet, right? What's important is that you do something and that it's good and you like it. And a one act could be that. It's very simple, but gives you plenty of space to do your art, do action, and present a clear story. Next, let's go over the simple two-act structure. And this is what it sounds like. The comic book is split in half by the act break. So the first half of the comic is the first act, and the second half of the comic is the second act. Now, there are different models to do a two-act structure with, and we're going to go over 4 of them. But generally speaking, we're presented with the world in one way in the first act, then something happens at the end of the first act, which is, I don't know if you can call it the inciting incident here, but it is an inciting incident of a kind. So in the second act, we're going to have to resolve whatever happened at the first act and fix that. In the second act, we'll have to solve that problem, that challenge that we build up to in the first act. But let's go over some actual models of second acts to show off how it works. The first one is the rise and fall model. In the first act, the world is good. Normally, we're dealing with like what you would call B plots, so social plots, town plots, things that involve like normal life. There's a problem at the PTA meeting. There was a misunderstanding with a friend. The hero has a big date coming up. Generally, life is good though. So it can even be kind of, we've got a bake sale and we love to do our bake sale. Everything's kind of going well. And you can have plots which don't present terrible problems or challenges. They can just be normal life challenges or even good things happening to the characters. Then, as the name suggests, it's a rise and fall. At the end of the first act, the villain strikes or something goes terribly wrong. And so now the world isn't good. We reverse things. The world is bad. And the hero has to solve the problem or defeat the villain and restore this order that will allow the world to return to a good state and everything will be happy again. Second, we have the flawed response model. A problem arises toward the beginning of the first act, and the heroes then go to tackle that problem, but they enact an imperfect solution. Perhaps the solution even demonstrates their own flaws for a little bit of, dramatic heft. And then when this flawed solution fails to hold, it breaks and it creates the true inciting incident at the end of the first act. Or it creates a second inciting incident at the end of the first act, which then is a new problem which has to be solved in the second act. So we solved the first problem in the first act, but it led to the second problem of the second act. And that's the flawed response model. Is basically the first act logically connects to the second act because the first problem logically connects to the second problem. Now, it's also possible to just have the heroes try an initial solution which never works, or it only results in a temporary setback for the villain. And you'll see this in children's shows. I think of the Power Rangers model, where they would fight goons and they'd beat them. But then there was a monster, so the monster would come down. They'd beat the monster, and then the monster would get huge, and so they'd get into a giant fighting robot. It's just sort of, they'd enact a solution, but the solution wasn't permanent. And so then the next thing would happen. Don't write a comic as poor as the Power Rangers storylines were. But it's okay to have the heroes try an initial solution, which is simply not going to be big enough to hold the entire problem with the flawed response model. Third, we have the slow burn model. We open on the characters and they have their lives they're dealing with. The world doesn't have to be quite as perfect as the rise and fall model. They have ongoing struggles, ongoing social issues, social dramas, community dramas. But then we intercut their problems with the work of the antagonists, the forces of evil, whatever. So we see them building. We see the antagonist has a plan, and maybe he's watching the heroes, or he's watching the town. But he doesn't really strike until the end of the first act. So the heroes think they have their problems because their life is full of drama or minor inconveniences. The bridge is out, there was an earthquake and the hero had to fly up and save some people. He got some problems, but then the villain strikes and you're really left with, this is actually a problem. This is really a danger. And so now we spend the second act dealing with the villain who we've had time to set up properly in the first act so the audience gets to know them. And so unlike the rise and fall model, which is, you might think of the movie Titanic, it's a love story and then they hit an iceberg and they're all going to drown, right? That's a rise and fall model. This is really more about we just wait for the villain to strike. And so in the first act, we can get a lot of these B and C plots in, which, entertain the reader. That's social drama, the other stuff. That's entertaining. But then in the second act, we focus then on the villain who we've gotten to know. So it's just a nice, clear way to have a problem presented or have an interesting villain pop up in your story for the heroes to fight. The fourth one and the last one we're going to look at is the double problem model. Here, the heroes are presented with a problem that they can solve in the first act, but in doing so, they reveal a second, larger problem, which then needs to be solved in the second act. So you defeat a villain who's been robbing banks, but then you discover they were robbing banks in order to fund the building of a weapon that'll destroy the whole city for another, much worse supervillain. Or goblins have been raiding the local towns. You find where the goblins are, kill all the goblins, and free their captives. But an elf maiden tells you that they've poisoned the world tree and it's going to die soon if they don't take action, right? So solving the first problem leads to the second, larger problem. It's harder to defeat this tougher villain who has a city-destroying weapon. It's harder to go find a cure for the poison to the world tree because it's, hidden behind an ogre. So one problem leads to the next problem. We just jump into the action and the heroes just solve problems. And this model works well with highly competent heroes who are not necessarily doing a lot of B-plot work. They're not really going through a lot of social struggles. They're more about adventuring. Their problems are mostly in the quests they undertake to defeat villains. So you can still have B plots or C plots, little social plots and relationship plots in this, but you're probably not going to have very big ones, and that works well if you want to write a comic where they don't have very big social problems. So it just kind of depends on what you want your story to be made up of. Do you really want it to be mostly fighting villains, mostly fighting goblins and ogres and trolls and dragons? Or is it set in a certain town and set in an institution like a school? And you want a lot of these secondary plots. You want a lot of social drama. That can kind of determine which type of act structure you want to use. These are 4 2-act structures. They're all very good to use. If you want to use any of them, they will work fine, and they're still relatively simple, not complex, not difficult to do, but provide you a little more meat to sink your teeth into than a simple 1-act comic structure. And we're going to cover some more, but if you're thinking about which model do you want to use, kind of think about, what do I want my comic to be? Maybe your comic's going to be 20 pages long, and that 20 pages, what do I want to have? A lot of times when you're a young writer, you try to overstuff everything you write, whether it's a short story or an epic novel. You try to cram as much as you can into it, and that's okay. But oftentimes you'll find that you can simplify down from your initial idea and just focus on the most core things that you most want in the book. And the book will still be great without all the extra stuff, which maybe you're not completely dedicated to, because making a comic is a lot of work. Writing anything and doing it well is a lot of work. So think about the things you definitely want in your comic and how that might play out with each of these different models and which will work best for you. All right? So next time we will be covering part 2 of example act structures, and we will cover a simple 3-act structure and the 4-act TV structure, which might provide even more complex storytelling methods for you to use in your comic. But we'll see then. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.